Boeing Starliner is scheduled to take its first astronauts to space on a test mission scheduled for no earlier than May 6th. This mission was originally supposed to launch in early 2017. Let's dive into everything you need to know about this first crewed flight, CFT, and the messy history of Boeing Starliner CST-100 spacecraft. This launch is currently scheduled for May 6th, 2024 at 10:34 p.m. Eastern Time. The launch vehicle is ULA's Atlas V rocket, lifting off from Launch Complex 41 at Cape Canaveral, Florida. The spacecraft will take astronauts Sunita Williams and Butch Wilmore to the International Space Station. It's currently scheduled to dock with the ISS on May 8th at 12:48 a.m. The mission will last about 8 days. Coverage is scheduled to begin at 6:30 p.m. Eastern on May 6th on NASA TV and NASA's YouTube channel. And as always, these dates and times are very subject to change. Unlike SpaceX's Crew Dragon and previous NASA capsules, Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, Starliner will land on land, not in the water. It has multiple landing site options, but for this launch, the primary landing site is the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. This launch has been delayed for various reasons, but most recently just because of traffic at the International Space Station. Basically, the Harmony module of the ISS has 2 docking ports for Crew Dragon and Starliner. However, the forward docking port is basically easier to access, so they wanted to open that up for Starliner's mission. Earlier this week, there was the Crew 8 Crew Dragon at the forward docking port. Crew vehicles stay with the crew, basically, so everyone always has a way to get off space station if there's an emergency. And then there was an uncrewed SpaceX Dragon resupply vehicle at the other port. The supply ship successfully undocked on April 28th, and then Crew 8 astronauts undocked from the forward docking port and moved their spacecraft on May 2nd to the other docking port, leaving that forward-facing docking port open for Starliner. There's a lot of traffic up there. Boeing has had 2 uncrewed test flights before this, OFT-1 and OFT-2, and, well, there were problems. Let's go through the history of Boeing Starliner and why it has taken so long for this spacecraft to have this first crewed flight test. After the retirement of the space shuttle, NASA turned to commercial providers to build the next generation of crew vehicles for transportation to low Earth orbit. This was called the Commercial Crew Program, and it differed from previous models of how NASA built spaceships. Because yes, those were all built by commercial companies, but NASA owned and operated the vehicle. NASA was deeply involved in every stage of design, every aspect of testing, launching, and operating the spacecraft. Commercial crew is different. NASA has its stringent requirements for the spacecraft that must be met, but the contractors own and operate their own spacecraft. These are their designs. NASA is operating on a fixed-price contract model, which is cheaper for NASA. They're basically paying for the development of these spacecraft and transportation services, and then the companies are free to use these crew vehicles however they wish, hence why there are private Crew Dragon flights. It's worth noting that Boeing has said they don't currently have a commercial use case for Starliner, though it is possible that will change once they show it can safely fly with crew. So, the commercial crew contract was signed in 2014. Boeing got $4.2 billion, while SpaceX received $2.6 billion. The reasoning for Boeing getting the larger contract, according to NASA documents, was that at the time, William Gerstenmaier thought that their approach was better. Boeing built modules of the ISS, so they have extensive experience in taking on this kind of project. The initial crew test flight was supposed to be by early 2017. But in 2016, Boeing delayed it to early 2018 and then to late 2018 because of issues with the mass of the spacecraft and then supplier issues. It's worth noting that SpaceX was delayed as well. A 2017 report from the GAO, or Government Accountability Office, made it clear that neither crew vehicle would be ready before 2019, which was a good estimate. SpaceX's Crew Dragon had its first crewed test flight in 2020. The report pointed out that part of the delay was this new way of building spacecraft for NASA, because the collaboration required a lot more time than anyone expected because NASA wasn't involved in the development at every level of these vehicles on a day-to-day basis, but had very strict requirements that had to be met. A 2019 report from the NASA Office of the Inspector General also found that NASA and Boeing amended their contract in 2016. NASA committed to purchasing 6 total flights. In the original contract, NASA purchased 2 total flights, and the 4 additional flights were optional. The price was an additional $287.2 million, and this was kind of just to ensure that Boeing continued developing Starliner, and NASA's own OIG called this unnecessary. So let's move on to the tests. The first uncrewed test flight of Boeing Starliner occurred on December 20th, 2019. It did not go well. It was supposed to dock with the ISS, but a series of problems ensured that didn't happen. Here are just a few of them. Starliner's onboard timer drew an incorrect time from the Atlas V launch vehicle, and the spacecraft didn't correctly execute an orbit insertion burn needed to get to the ISS. Also, there was a software issue with the valves that control Starliner's thrusters. Another issue, there were significant interruptions in communication with the spacecraft that affected the ground's ability to direct it and would have impeded the astronauts' ability to communicate with Earth if anybody had been on board. This mission was widely considered a failure. NASA officially designated it as a high-visibility close call, and Boeing had to redo the mission. That led to OFT-2 in May 2022. While NASA and Boeing did proclaim the second mission a success, it did still have issues. The launch was initially scrubbed due to more valve issues on the spacecraft. These seemed to be the same valves that had problems during OFT-1. Then, after a delay of over a year, the spacecraft finally launched, but it had multiple thrusters fail as well as some other issues during the flight. But it did successfully dock and undock with the ISS and land safely back on Earth, hence calling it a success. Keep in mind that SpaceX's Crew Dragon first crewed test flight was May 30th, 2020, and the first operational flight, Crew 1, was November 16th, 2020. During this gap from the last space shuttle flight in 2011 to SpaceX's Crew Dragon flight, the Russian Soyuz capsule was the only way for astronauts to get to and from the ISS. By the end, NASA was paying over $90 million per seat for the Soyuz. Okay, so we're at mid-2022. And Boeing's uncrewed test flight was successful enough to proceed with a crewed demonstration. That was scheduled for July 21st, 2023. But, yep, you guessed it, delayed again. During a series of in-depth reviews that were supposed to certify Starliner for this flight, NASA uncovered some issues that delayed the launch indefinitely. First, a parachute issue. The soft links that attached the lines of Starliner's 3 main parachutes to their anchor tethers on the capsule had a failure load limit lower than previously thought. This meant that if one chute failed, the other 2 would not be able to handle the capsule's weight. Not exactly a small problem, especially considering the fact that during the pad abort tests they did for Starliner in 2019, only 2 of the main 3 parachutes deployed. The second issue was that the capsule was covered in tape to protect the wiring. Well, it turns out that this tape is flammable, and some of the areas it is in may be subject to higher temperatures than what the tape is rated for. According to the press conference on April 25th, Boeing had to remove about a mile of this tape from the capsule. So now, here we are, 7 years after the original crewed launch date of Boeing Starliner. The spacecraft appears to be ready to launch. As of the middle of 2023, Boeing had lost $1.5 billion on Starliner, and it hasn't even flown crew yet. As I mentioned, Boeing is contracted to fly 6 total flights to the ISS. SpaceX will fly 14, and they have already flown 8. This will likely take NASA through 2030, which is when the agency may or may not retire the ISS. Space Station's fate is not quite certain. As calculated by Ars Technica, that equals out to about $183 million per seat for Boeing and $88 million per seat for SpaceX's Crew Dragon. I want to caveat, though, that Boeing Starliner can technically fit a possible 5th astronaut into the capsule that SpaceX's Crew Dragon cannot. It's not clear, though, whether NASA will actually assign an additional astronaut to operational Starliner missions or just use that space for more cargo. So right now, it's better to use the traditional number of 4 astronauts per mission. If this test flight goes well and the capsule is certified by NASA, then we'd likely see the first operational Starliner launch later this year or early next. Is it a mess? Yes. Do I have confidence that NASA wouldn't launch astronauts in a spacecraft they believe was unsafe? also yes. NASA has strict guidelines on what odds it will consider acceptable for the loss of the crew. For this flight, it was 1/270, and Boeing exceeded that with a 1/295 statistic for loss of crew. If you're interested in their numbers compared to SpaceX, for their demonstration mission in 2020, it was 1/276. So Boeing's is technically better than SpaceX's was, but also these are just numbers. Given all of the issues, the many issues that Boeing has been having on their aircraft side, they need this flight to go well. They're two different divisions within the company, but the aircraft negligence is on everyone's mind. For the reporters as we cover this launch, the viewers as they watch it, I imagine it is also present for those at NASA and Boeing that they have been definitely avoiding answering any questions about this, as well as for the astronauts who will be in the capsule. Let's hope this goes well.